Good morning, everybody. We are live also today. This is our second Baltic Talk. I'm Federica Pastore from CCB, and today we have Nils, who is our Fisheries Policy Officer.
Yes.
And today we will talk about TAC and quotas.
Yes.
So we want to start soon?
Yeah,
Right
we will start right now. So I guess the topic of today is the TAC and quotas, the TAC and quota regulations and what they are and how they come about. So the first issue is
What are
TAC
and quota?
What are they? Yeah, what are TAC and quota? First of all, TAC, TAC. It stands for Total Allowable Catch. It is the overarching limit of what you can take from the ocean in a certain area. So, as we are this Coalition Clean Baltic, we're going to talk about the Baltic. So the Baltic Sea Area is well, what most people consider to be the Baltic, but also a little bit above the islands between, the Danish islands, the straits between Denmark and Sweden and Germany, also is the Baltic. So for the Baltic, a TAC, a TAC is said. But then we also said the term quota. So what's quota then? Well, the TAC is the total allowable catch in the whole area per species. The quota is what each country get of that total allowable catch. So you set 10,000 as a total catch, and then you divide that 10,000 up per country. And then each country can decide on how they allocate the quota. To what fishermen or to what fishing sector or fleet segment they want to divide this up. So tax and quotas are the primary way of how we manage our stocks. We have all kinds of measures that we aim to do, and certainly us as NGOs we propose and support, but the tax and quota is the primary management tool. So we decide annually, this is the amount we can take, and no more, and I would say no less, but no more, of each stock. So that it's the sort of most important and basic management tool we have. So the idea, of course, is to set a TAC on a level for each fish stock, at the sustainable level, meaning that the fish stock can reproduce, that it can sustain itself. We can take this much out of the stock, but not sort of damage the stock in a way that it can't reproduce and basically refill or repopulate the gap. So we take out a number of fish, but the stock has to be able to grow to bring those fish, so to speak, back. Otherwise, obviously, we're going to empty this. The stock is going to be depleted. So that's the idea of setting a TAC. We do it that way. If we have, our facts right, we should be able to sustain this stock basically forever. That's the intention with setting a proper TAC. Now, the TAC is not just or a TAC or quotas. They're not just a management tool to sort of, like I said, just to elaborate on how much a sector gets to fish and then make money off. But the point is, of course, to manage our stocks with TACs smart enough so that the stock not only can replenish itself or rebuild itself, but also that we have fish that are old enough, that are large and small, that they are spread across their natural range where they're supposed to be. And that is basically a healthy stock. So our fishing policies, they have this as the primary tool. There are other environmental policies that have perhaps a different objective or a different ambition than just setting a TAC, but we'll come back to that at a later stage in other talks that we'll have. But for now, we're going to focus on the TAC and then the consequent quotas. Like I said, TACs are the primary management tool we have. So, that's basically it. Total allowable catch linked to quotas. That quotas are divided up in countries, per stock, per fish, and then in each country, coastal fishermen or trawler fishermen or whatever, they get a share of this quota, and that's up to the member states to decide internally.
So the second question is how?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, how is all the that's the interesting.
How did you decide it?
Yeah, that's the interesting part, of course. It's so who decides, and also from our perspective, who's responsible? If things go wrong, who's responsible? Well, there's a short and long answer to this, so I'm going to do the short first, and then we're going to go through the long one. But the short answer is basically that the member states decide jointly, together with the Commission, based on a proposal from the Commission of total allowable catch each year. So it's done yearly. That's the short answer. It's the member states in the the Fishery Council each year that decides this, but on a proposal coming from the Commission. So, but how is that all done? Where does that proposal come from? Why does the member state say this or that, or how do they talk in between each other before decisions are taken? Who knows who says what and who supports what? This is what we're going to talk just a little bit about here. But first, there's a number of players that you need to know about. So I'm going to drop a number of players here, and then I'm going to try to position them in this cycle of establishing quotas or tax. So we have the Commission, we have ICES or ICES, which is a scientific group. I'll come back to that. We obviously have stakeholders like ourselves, NGOs, or other interests, that can be anything from fish retailers to tourism to angling to, obviously the fishing industry, of course. So stakeholders in a wide term. And here we have a body in the Baltic that I'll talk about, which we call the Baltic Sea Advisory Council. So that's another actor or player. Then, of course, we have the member states. So the Commission, the scientists in ICES, the stakeholder groups, and then the member states. Now, the member states is also obviously the member state, individual member state, but it's also they also cooperate, of course. They talk to each other, and here in the Baltic region, they have formed a loose cooperation called BaltFish, which is the Baltic member states meeting together and discussing fishery topics. And then, of course, we have the wider EU Council, the Fishery Council, with every EU member state taking part in the discussion. So those are the players. We have the Commission, ICES or scientists, we have stakeholders, and the member states.
So basically four main groups.
Yeah, four main groups, obviously of many subgroups.
Yes.
So how does this come about, or where does this, how does this process work? So for all countries within the EU and around the Baltic, we only have one that's not in the EU, which is Russia. I'll cover that at a later talk, why that potentially is problematic. But anyway, the rest of us, we're all members of the EU. So as we are a member of the EU, the decision-making process linked to this TAC setting stems from the EU treaty. So it's the EU treaty, which is, the basic constitution of the EU, the treaty. We call it the Lisbon Treaty in popular terms these days. And Article 43 of that treaty says that it is the Council that should adopt a proposal, on a proposal from the Commission, should adopt and fix fishing opportunities for the EU. So it is set in the basic constitution of the EU. Okay, so that's very simple. It's a very short statement. It doesn't say anything about how that works, but that's how it is. So it's the Commission's proposal that the Council take into account and decide together with the Commission on quotas each year. So one can note, for example, that the European Parliament doesn't have anything to do with this. It's the Council and the Commission. So it can most easily be explained, all this, as an annual cycle. So it's something that occurs every year. So they, like I said, they take this TAC and quota decision each year for the stock or for the fishing the coming year. So this year we'll be talking, the member states and the Commission will be deciding on fishing opportunities for 2019. So, like I said, we have our players, and the Commission is the one that's responsible for developing a proposal. But obviously the Commission does not act, does not make things up or put their proposal on a level which they feel is comfortable. They have EU rules to follow, and we have a number of such rules that sort of limit them in how they can or where they can go on proposals for TACs. So the treaty only says how it should be done, or who decides, but how it should be done, or exactly on what levels the quotas should be, is more detailed out in our regional management plan. So we have a regional management plan for the major fish stocks in the Baltic, which is sprat, herring, and cod. We also have, obviously, quite active fishing for salmon. Salmon doesn't currently have a management plan, but it probably will soon. But those are the main stocks that are also part of this management plan. We also have a TAC set for place. Place is not part of the management plan, but it also has rules connected to how you can propose or not set the tax. So the Commission doesn't act out of the blue. They have rules that they have to follow. There are also overarching objectives in our common fishery policy that we have decided in the EU. We have a new one since 2013 that says clearly, or sets clearly, some objectives that the Commission has to follow. And then we have some details in the Baltic management plan on where the stocks should be and how high the quotas can be set, or the TACs can be set. So, like I said, it's an annual process. So it basically starts with the Commission asking for scientific advice. Mm-hmm. They ask for advice on what's the state of the stocks. So they have the rules in the management plan, but they also obviously need to know, okay, what's the status right now? So they ask ICES, which is an international body of scientists called ICES, ICES. So it's the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas. It's a very strange name, perhaps, but it's a very old entity now. I think it was formed in 1907. But it is basically a group of scientists, national scientists from all over, taking part in working groups that are experts on each particular stock. So Commission asks them, what's the state of these stocks? The cod, the sprat, the herring, the salmon, all the stocks relevant here in the Baltic. They work on this for quite a long time, several months, the beginning of almost, and also sometimes the end of the year before and the beginning of the year, to present their advice. So the cycle starts with ICES presenting these advice. So they present it to the Commission, of course, which is the one that sort of orders or asks for this advice and also pays for this advice. So they pay the scientists for their work, of course. Nothing is free in this world, even though we tend to believe so sometimes. So this advice is presented usually around end of May each year. So this is when we then are updated on, are the stocks in a good or bad shape? Is it getting better or is it getting worse? The ICES advice is not only, the ICES reporting or advice, as it's called, advice. It's not just saying this is the state of the stock. ICES also delivers an actual advice. They give a number. They say this would be the TAC that would make sure that the stock can replenish itself, that it can grow, that we are not sort of eating away on the resource, but actually making sure we're taking just the interest and the interest meaning in bank terms, that we're not taking our savings, but we're just taking a little bit of the surplus off the stock so it can regrow and even grow perhaps bigger next year than it is this year. So ICES gives an actual number advice. They also give a number of options based on the rules in place. So if a management plan says that you can fish from this to this end, depending on the status of the stock. So if the stock is in good shape, you can fish perhaps this much to this much. If it's in worse shape, you can take that much to that much. So they usually develop or they present these options, but they always give an actual advice. So this is the number we think is relevant in light of all the information we have on this stock. So this is advice that comes, like I said, the end of May, and it's shared openly. So everyone can read it. Everyone gets it at the same time. So the Commission gets it, the member states, the advisory councils, all the stakeholders, everyone gets this. Yeah. It's both in form of a shorter advice paper, like I just said, with some basic facts of the stock, but it's also connected to a much larger report of all the facts, the data, and everything. So you can read how yeah, exactly. So how did they get to this number? Or you can track that somehow in these reports. So the Commission gets the advice. They obviously look at it from their perspective of being the one in charge of presenting a proposal, but they also want input from others. So they ask, for example, then stakeholders for their views on these this advice from ICES. Yeah. So here comes this stakeholder body or this group that we in the Baltic call the Baltic Sea Advisory Council. So it's a group formed of mainly fishing interests and what is called other interest groups, which is mostly environmental NGOs like CCB and WWF and Oceana and other NGOs like that. So everyone's free to comment or give advice, of course, but this Baltic Sea Advisory Council is actually part of our annual cycle package. They're supposed to be asked and they're supposed to deliver some kind of advice or comment to the advice, if you like, to the Commission. And obviously anyone else who would listen, of course, to the member states. So this happens basically immediately. I mean, the Council takes note of the ICES advice, starts looking and drafting a position on this. Obviously, at the same time, we have the member states looking at the same advice, wondering, okay, this is the state of the stocks. Politicians of various parties that have an interest or not obviously have comments perhaps, but it is the government in each country that obviously is the final decision maker here. This is not a parliamentary usually issue in most countries. Some countries have input from the wider parliament to the government, but mostly it's the government. So, like I said earlier, here in the Baltic region, we have a loosely formed cooperation between the member states. So, in the region, they have formed what is called Baltfish. So it's if you like, it's a miniature council. It's the Baltic member states discussing the Baltic topics and the Baltic fish stocks. The idea or thinking is that we should regionally be able to decide or advise on issues relevant for our region. There's no need to talk about things happening in Southeast Mediterranean in light of the Baltic necessarily. So this is the intention. So this loose cooperation called Baltfish obviously starts looking at the advice, and they have regular meetings where they discuss these topics. Now, as I said, May, we're coming in towards summer, so there's a little summer break here in the middle, but the Commission is not dormant during this time. They also produce what is called their views on fishing opportunities, which is basically an overarching paper looking at the state of the stocks, looking at the EU rules in place, timelines we've decided in EU that we need to follow, for example, of reaching certain goals. So they produce a paper called Fishing Opportunities. This is usually presented in June, something like that. And it gives a framework of how the Commission is thinking regarding the fish stocks and how they will, what kind of proposal they will come with later in the year. So if they clearly underline, we need to reach this goal by this date, we must fulfill this, we must improve this, you get an indication of where they're, what they're leaning, what rules they're leaning on, and how they will look at the ICES advice. So the Advisory Council works on their position, the member states are looking at the advice. At the same time, we both get this paper from the Commission called Fishing Opportunities. And now we move into summer. So usually the Advisory Council has some kind of joint position mid-June, something like that, just as everyone basically leaves around here anyway for summer holidays. And the process sort of restarts again in the end of August. So end of August, beginning of September, Baltfish meets. They have a meeting, calling together a meeting, where obviously the TAC and quotas are the sort of primary discussion point. Usually at exact that time, the Commission presents its actual quota and TAC and quota proposal. So we have to that meeting the actual TAC proposal. Now this year it took place in Stockholm. Currently Sweden is chairing this Baltfish group, so the meeting was here in Stockholm end of August, and the Commission indeed did present their proposals for TACs. Now I say we and things all the time here with Baltfish. I just said that it's the regional group of member states, but we as NGOs and also other stakeholders were invited to take part in this open discussion they have in this Baltfish group called Baltfish Forum. So it's a number of hours where we sit around the table and discuss these topics that are relevant. In this case, like I said, it's the TACs. So we get to share our views, basically from the same views that has been presented already in the Baltic Sea Advisory Councils usually. And I have to say, quite often, obviously, we don't necessarily agree with the fishing sector on the TACs, but that's for a later talk. But anyway, we're free to talk to the member states and obviously the member state to react to what we say during the TACs. And usually the Commission is also present to explain their proposals for TAC. Why did they propose this, and etc. So again, something that we will come back to in a later talk, but the interesting part of all this is the ICES has given an advice, but very rarely or quite often the Commission proposal is not the same as the advice. It's obviously a different number based on some other considerations that they usually explain at that meeting. So then the discussion again starts up within the member states and this Baltfish group, of course. At the same time, obviously, everyone else around Europe can read ICES advice and they can have views on this, of course. Discussions can take place in Brussels and the working groups that exist in Brussels. But most of the discussion then would supposed to be happening in the Baltic region or within Baltfish. So they meet regularly, like I said, and also usually during or after this forum meeting, they have what is called a high-level group meeting, which is basically closed-doors meeting. So it's just the member states. We don't know exactly who says what in these meetings usually. We have, we hope in the future that we will get more transparency in there and to be able to know exactly who supports what position or not. But anyway, this Baltfish process now speeds up dramatically because at the October Council meeting, the October Fishery Council meeting is the official date where they have to decide on the quotas for the coming year. Usually mid-October is when they decide. So from that point where the Commission proposes delivers its proposal for its quotas, the discussions are ongoing. Obviously, stakeholders and everyone is saying things, supporting this and that, arguing for this and that quota. But the member states are working and trying to find common ground, for example, in the Baltic. So the idea currently is that there's no official rule or demand that says that the region has to agree and that the region's proposal is going to be followed when you come to the October Council, when France and Portugal and Greece and Italy is there. But there is this sort of agreement that if the Baltic region would actually agree on a number of TACs, the wider group in the European Council, when they meet in this whole European setting, would take that into account and listen to that joint or agreed position. Now, lately, we haven't had a situation where the member states actually have agreed in the region here in the Baltic. We've had very divergent views, so it's not been possible to create a Baltic joint position to go to the October Council and say, here's our joint proposal, this is what we think is fair and relevant, and basically the other ministers would support that. So the whole discussion or the actual negotiation takes place in the council or at the council meeting, making it usually last overnight, and early morning hours they decide on this and that quota or this and that proposal that is acceptable to everyone, including the Commission. Important here is the Commission also has to accept, of course, the proposals that are presented. So the final day is this council meeting where they decide the quotas. And like I said, there are many steps along the way, and there are sort of I was going to use the term watering down, but there are steps along the way that affect the level of the quotas. Many things are taking into account, adding socioeconomic factors and things like that each member state will put forward, making the quota's final number sometimes differ dramatically from both the Commission's proposal and the ICES advice. But like I said, it's an annual cycle. It starts in basically with the Commission asking for scientific advice, which is produced then in May, and then over the summer towards the October Council, the quotas are discussed, and unfortunately, many times, late hours during these council meetings, things are decided finally. But the responsible actors and the ones, taking charge or that needs to face up to whatever decisions are taken are the member states and the Commission. There are no other entities or someone deciding anything. This is it. It's the member states. So people many times say, oh, the EU decides or whatever. It's not the EU. The member states decide. They need to negotiate a position that they can agree on. That's how it works. The Commission is a player, but it's not the final decision maker. And the Commission cannot be alone against all the member states demanding certain quota. That won't work. So it's basically the member states, meaning mine and your minister in the Baltic region is the one responsible for the final proposal. They have agreed to it. They have negotiated it. So that's the basic setup of all this. Maybe it sounds very complicated. It's not really that complicated, but it takes time. And there are many problems with this process, but we're not going to dive into that today.
No,
we're going to come back to that.
When? On Friday afternoon?
Yeah, on Friday afternoon. On Friday, we're going to be talking about basically what's the problem with all this.
Yep.
Now we just described the process and who is the responsible players.
How it works.
Exactly. But there are problems here. And certainly we think there are problems, but actually quite a few others think there are problems too. And what those problems are and why they come up each year and what type of problems we have with all this, we're going to talk about next time.
So
Okay.
if you have any questions or doubts, you're free to comment.
Yes,
After this live.
of course.
And thank you, Nils.
Oh,
and
sure.
see you on Friday afternoon.
Friday afternoon. Good. See you
Bye.
then. Bye, guys.